I work at the Brimstone Tavern. Written by user 6 feet below. The Brimstone Tavern is not your ordinary tavern, our customers are that of another world. You know, monsters. Cryptids and ghosts alike all come to the tavern for a Bloody Mary or scotch with eyeballs. Some even come to the tavern to just converse with other patrons. Although Jimmy doesn't particularly like it when they loiter around. Jimmy is the owner of the tavern, a man of few words and a few missing limbs. He had his grace of monsters when he was just 14. He and his father went on a week hunting trip when a blizzard rolled in and trapped them in their cabin, with only a week worth of food. Jimmy's father hacked off his right arm and left leg. The old man could barely believe his luck when the search and rescue came to his aid when a Wendigo had possessed his father. It's a tale he likes to tell all of his patrons, all of whom would congratulate him on his survival and would throw jokes at him every once in a while, like any other night. I made my way into the tavern through the back door and clocked in just as Jake clocked out. We passed each other and gave a nod of acknowledgement before we parted ways. That was until Jake stopped me at the door. "Mr. Clark will be here around 11, and with that, I walked out to the back of the bar and started to serve drinks. On some occasions, some of the patrons would call ahead of time to tell them of their arrival. We only do this for the sake of other patrons. Not all monsters, cryptids, and ghosts get along. The rest of my shift was uneventful, which is good. That was until I smelt the distinct smell of swamp water and something rotten. Right on time Mr. Clark entered the tavern. His yellow glowing eyes moved about the faces. His green skin glistened under the light as he walked up to the bar. He sat down on a stool and hunched over the table. "Mr. Clark, how's it been?" I asked as I prepared as usual, a scotch with human eyeballs. Clark grunted and his gills shifted. I handed him a wet towel to keep himself hydrated. "Another group of snooty teens stumbled into my swamp, but I took care of them," he said, and flashed his sharp yellow-stained teeth at me and slammed his drink. He tapped his glass and I prepared another one for him. "Can you believe it? Some nosy teens that want to prove that they're brave enough to mess with me, ha." Clark then barked out a laugh that made me shudder. I can't imagine what he had done to those teens. Correction, I can imagine what he did, but I don't want to. That's the catch to this job. You get exposed to the dark and macabre deeds they do to us humans. Once they down enough alcohol that will kill any human, they'll tell you their stories with great detail. Not only that, but I have to make sure everyone is not trying to cause trouble. I watched as Clark popped an eyeball into his mouth and bit down. The eyeball popped in his mouth and some of the fluid got onto my shirt sleeve. He chuckled and turned to the redhead next to him. She sipped her Bloody Mary casually and avoided making any eye contact with the swamp monster next to her. "Say, have you vampires ever tried a human heart before?" he asked the vampire, who rolled her eyes and turned to him with a smile. "Yes, but it can be messy." Clark laughed and asked for another scotch. I poured him his drink and went down the bar to tend to another patron, a werewolf named Tom. He sneered at the redhead but kept his mouth shut unless he wanted to tangle with a vampire in his human form. "All vampires think they're too good," he mumbled as he took the pitcher of beer over to his group of friends that were all huddled in a booth in the dark corner of the tavern. I shook my head and returned to Clark, who had now started to bug the pale and skinny old man next to him. The old man scarfed down his third plate of organs and ordered another plate. All the while he listened to Clark's tale of the late teens. "Their bodies are at the bottom of the swamp right now. I can't wait to get back and tear into them," Clark stated as he licked his now chapped lips. I handed him another wet towel and he wiped himself down before he asked for another drink. I emptied the rest of the scotch and grabbed another bottle from the back. When I came back, it was complete chaos, as Clark and the old man fought on the floor of the tavern. I cursed under my breath and had set the bottle down before I went to the front of the bar and tried to stop the fight. Hint the word tried. The two of them were covered in human organs and had large gashes on their torsos, forearms, and face. Clark let out a snarl and tackled the old man to the floor. They struck each other with blow after blow before a loud bang interrupted the fight. A bullet hole next to their bodies. I looked behind me to find Jimmy with his shotgun in his hands. He motioned for the two to stand up with the barrel of the gun and kicked them out of the tavern. I stood there stunned and afraid that I'll lose my job. Jimmy then reared on me and pulled me to the back of the tavern and sat me down. "What the hell?" he shouted as he slammed the shotgun onto his desk and sent papers flying to the floor. I went to the back to get another bottle of scotch. Clark seemed like he was in good spirits, so I thought I could leave them for a second. "I didn't know a fight would break out," I said nervously. Jimmy shook his head and rubbed his left temple with his left hand, his prosthetic hanging loosely by his side. "What did I tell you?" he asked. "Not to leave the bar," I replied. "And you did exactly what I told you not to do," he snapped. I looked to the ground and avoided looking into his eyes. I spent the rest of my shift in the kitchen while Stacy took care of the patrons. I also had to pay for the broken cutlery, bottles, and clean the red and blue blood off of the wooden floors. It took a good minute to get all the blood out, but when I was done my shift was already over. I clocked out and walked to my car but was stopped by a dark shadow that walked out from behind my car. It was the old man from earlier. His wounds were still bleeding but he didn't seem to care or notice as he walked around my car to stand in front of me. His gaunt face was covered in deep scratches. "I didn't get to finish my meal," he stated as he took a step closer to me. I took a step back. "I'm just so hungry." Saliva dripped from the corner of his mouth and down his chin. "Look. Why don't I head back inside to get you a to-go bag?" I said as I slowly started to make my way to the back door, the old man's eyes never leaving my own. When I looked away to grab the handle, that was the worst mistake I could have made. Because as soon as I broke eye contact, the man lunged at me and tackled me to the ground. He held my arms down with the strength I didn't know he had. He licked his lips and leaned down with his mouth wide open. I could feel his hot breath on my neck. We both then heard the sound of a gun cocking. Jimmy pointed the barrel of the gun to the man's head and told him to back off. The guy lifted his hands up and got off of me. He backpedaled a few feet before he stopped and cracked a smile. "I was just only teasing," the man spoke with a sickly sweet voice. Jimmy grunted and motioned for the man to leave and he did, but not before he looked at me and smirked. "Wendigos. Never know when they'll attack," Jimmy muttered. He helped me up off of the ground and patted my back. "Why don't you take tomorrow off? Jake can cover your shift." I thanked him before I got into my car and drove out of there. I had to park on the shoulder of the road to cry. I was almost killed, I thought as sobs racked through my body. Wendigos are the worst customers to have. I told you about my run-in with a Wendigo last time. This time I've got another experience that caused all sorts of problems for Jimmy, myself, and the other patrons. It's not uncommon to have customers that travel halfway across the world to come to our tavern. But they usually call ahead of time to warn us of their arrival. Since we don't have all the information concerning all monsters, cryptids, and ghosts. After my day off, I went back to work with a fresh mind and a bit more cautious than last time. Because of the incident, Jimmy had hired another bartender, who I had to train. His name was Finn. He was a lanky boy with flaming red hair and freckles that dotted his face. He also had an encounter with an otherworldly being. He never told me which monster he had ran into, so I didn't press him for the details. The only thing that gave me a vague idea of what kind of beast he ran into was 4 long scars on each of his forearms and neck. It could possibly have been a werewolf, a grim, or anything with sharp claws. But something told me that it was a werewolf just by Finn's reaction when a werewolf had entered the building. Tom gave me a quick nod of acknowledgement before he went to his usual booth in the far right corner of the tavern. A few more werewolves joined him, all of which entered the tavern in their wolf form. I placed out a lavender candle and lit it. Something Jimmy had learned over the years: lavender doesn't just calm humans, it can also calm monsters. There was a group of vampires on the other side of the tavern. The chupacabra sat on a stool at the bar sipping on a pure blood mocktail. The Jersey Devils chilled in the farthest top left corner booth, and many more all conversed and sipped their drinks. I smiled proudly, like a father would smile at his son after hitting a home run. Finn nervously served Aheg a plate of raw liver and kidneys. Her rattled breath could be heard underneath her balaclava. She thanked him and went to find a seat. I taught Finn how to make a scotch with eyeballs, a Bloody Mary, a bloody martini, and other drinks. It took him a while to figure out the right amount of blood to alcohol ratio. Most of the patrons were in good spirits, so they didn't mind the difference in ratios, while a few of them returned and requested me to make their next drink. I patted Finn on the back and told him that it was all right to make mistakes. The boy nodded his head and continued to serve drinks while I delivered food to the other patrons. I had to take the plate of kidneys and liver back to the kitchen for Stacy to cut them up for the hag. That's when Jimmy poked his head out of his office and called me to come in. "You got this?" I turned to ask Finn, but he was already busy with another customer. I smiled and left the bar stand, headed into Jimmy's office. I took a seat in one of the leather chairs and waited for Jimmy to finish up on the phone. "We've got a special patron coming in tonight, although they didn't specify their species," Jimmy stated as soon as he put the phone back onto its receiver. "We're not letting them in, are we?" I asked incredulously. Jimmy pursed his lips and sighed. "Money is money, Jess. But we don't even know their species. What if they have a terrible relationship with one of the other patrons? What if they prey on another monster? What if that's enough? I know the risks when I agreed to let them come here." Jimmy slammed his hand on the top of his desk and stared me down. I closed my mouth and didn't utter another word afterwards. Once I left his office, I felt an uneasy feeling settle in the pit of my stomach that made it churn. I felt sick from my anxiety. I've become close to most of the patrons here and I don't want anything bad to happen to them. A million what-ifs bounced around inside my head as I continued to serve the customers. It was near 4 in the morning when the tavern door opened to reveal a snake humanoid being with snakes for hair and big bulging yellow eyes. Their tongue flicked out from their mouth filled with needle-sharp teeth. One of the patrons looked directly into her eyes and turned to stone. The whole tavern turned into chaos as all of the patrons tried to shield their eyes. I looked over to see our new bartender had turned into a gray stone statue. I closed my eyes and I could hear her slither up to the bar. "My name is Sphino, daughter of Echidna and Typhon." I didn't need to hear any more to figure out what she was. We had a gorgon on our hands. "What would you like?" I asked, all the while I still had my eyes closed. Sphino hummed and I could hear her drum her long nails on the top of the bar as she looked at the drink menu. "A Malibu Sunset," she hissed out. I turned around and was able to finally open my eyes. I started to get her drink ready just as Jimmy walked out of his office. He looked at me and then to the statue of Finn. His face showed remorse and guilt, but he knew immediately who we were dealing with. He went back into his office, probably to call the cleaning services that deal with monsters. Once I was done making her drink, I closed my eyes, turned around, and cautiously placed the drink in front of her. I could hear her sip her drink and let out a sigh. "It's great to have a place to unwind," she laughed and asked for another Malibu Sunset. I prepared her drink right away, and wondered when she would leave. Another 19 Malibu Sunsets later, Sphino had slithered out of the tavern, leaving a dozen of our patrons petrified. Gorgons cause all sorts of problems for everyone. It took a while to find more help and to reinforce the call before you arrive policy to avoid further tragedies. Not many patrons and new customers enjoyed the reinforced policy, since some of them don't have the equipment to notify us beforehand. Not all ghouls, ghosts, and monsters have cell phones. "Hey Jess, how's it going?" Damien, an older gentleman with a wrinkled face, called out to me from the front of the tavern. Good, actually, I mumbled back as I carried a body bag into the kitchen, where Stacy had just finished prepping. I slammed the bag onto the table and went out back to pay the shady delivery guy before I returned to help cut up the corpse. I watched as Damien shuffled about behind the bar with a bottle of pig blood in his hand. I watched him closely as he placed the bottle next to the human blood. Damien, can you keep those two separate? You don't want to accidentally mix up the two. You don't want to deal with any angry customers on your first day, I said. Damien thanked me and moved the pig blood and placed it next to the goat blood. It wouldn't matter if we accidentally mixed those two, not all of the monsters can tell the difference between them. Unless they're vampires. But, we don't have to worry about them ordering a blood substitute. They prefer human blood over pig and goat blood. I stood behind the bar, serving drinks and food to our customers when a concoction of shouts and yelps erupted from the werewolves' booth. I made sure Damien knew what he was doing before I left my station to see what all the commotion was about. When I walked up to their booth, everyone grew quiet and moved aside to show a very drunken Tom. He laid across the table and had knocked over everyone's drinks and food. His head bobbed around slightly as he tried to look up at me. I sighed and helped the poor guy up to his feet and allowed his friends to walk him home. It's not every day we have to deal with extremely drunk ghouls and monsters. Most of them know how to pace themselves. I guess Tom had something on his mind, or maybe someone had challenged him to a drinking game. Who knows how it happened, just as long as they get home safely. Mr. Clark walked through the door when I reached my station. He had an aura of awkwardness to him as he sulked his way up to the bar. He took a seat next to the same red-headed vampire and ordered a scotch with 2 human eyeballs. Candace, the redhead, sneered at Clark before she got up and left the tavern. I could hear her heels fade into the distance as I prepared another drink for a gentleman dressed in an oversized trench coat. Clark ignored the rude gesture and continued to leisurely drink his glass of scotch. Damien, this is Clark, one of the regulars here. Clark, this is Damien, I introduced the two, which both gave a nod of acknowledgement before they went back to their previous tasks at hand. I carefully watched as Damien prepared a Bloody Mary for a very young-looking vampire. I was unsure if they were even allowed the drink. But, you can never tell with vampires. The rest of the evening went smoothly and without incidents, just how Jimmy likes it. That was. Until I noticed an alarming scent of iron. The air felt electrified, and the noise of the tavern seemed muffled to me. I gripped the bar and hung my head in my hand. I felt as if all the energy in me was sucked out. You okay there? Clark's muffled voice asked as static slowly crept across my vision. I felt lightheaded and everything seemed to move in slow motion as the world seemed to tilt. Then darkness, as I felt my body collapse to the hard wooden floor. I laid there for a few seconds before my vision returned. Damien had shuffled over to me and was now kneeling next to me with a concerned look on his face. But, there was something else, like fear. Are you all right? I heard someone say. I pushed myself up off of the floor and looked up to see Clark looking down on me over the bar. Yeah, I'm all right. I was just a little lightheaded. I pulled myself to my feet and looked around to see everyone had stopped what they were doing to stare at me. I smiled awkwardly and gave them a small wave of assurance that I was indeed okay. During my fainting spell, the culprit who caused the whole scene walked into the tavern. His hooves beat against the wooden floorboards, his horns nearly scraped the ceiling, and his yellow eyes strained on me. I couldn't tell if he was smirking or snarling due to his head being a goat's head. He sat down and looked at Damien before he ordered. It was hard to understand him as he bleated like a goat as we waved our hand over all the liquor bottles until he snorted. We took that as a yes and started to make a strong concoction of liquor, vodka, peppermint schnapps, gin, and then human blood. I handed the goatman his strange combination and watched as he chugged the whole thing in one drink. He slammed the glass down and demanded another after another. I catered to our new customer as Damien tended to the rest. I felt nauseous and weak. I was so disoriented that I accidentally grabbed the wrong bottle of blood and added it into the goatman's drink. I watched as he chugged it but ended up spitting it all over my face. I yelped as the alcohol burned my eyes and nose. I could hear a session of bleats and grunts as a chair fell to the floor. I cowered behind the bar and tried to get my vision back. I felt a massive hand grip my shirt and lift me off of the ground. Before I knew it, I could barely breathe as my back slammed into the farthest wall of the tavern. I heard a crack and felt sharp pain shoot up from my tailbone when I landed harshly on the floor. Blind, incapacitated, and afraid. I tried to find something to hide behind but the tavern had cleared out. There was no one. I felt a harsh kick to my stomach that nearly made me vomit. I prepared for another blow when a shrill shriek assaulted my ears. I sat in Jimmy's office as we awaited for the exorcist to arrive. We needed to forcefully drive Goatman out of the tavern. Who knew some salt could save my life? As Halloween draws near, our number of customers have dwindled. For the better too, you don't want to meet any of the patrons out of the workplace. Our protection policy doesn't pertain outside of the tavern. As I drove to the secluded area of the tavern, I couldn't help but think back to my run-in with the Wendigo and the Goat Man. Those two will definitely be a problem outside of work, if they find me, that is. You see, everything about the staff members' private lives is kept confidential, in order to protect them outside of work. So, if I were to run into any of them, I'm fair game. I pushed those thoughts to the back of my head. As I pulled into the employees' parking lot behind the tavern, Jake stood outside, with a lit cigarette in his mouth. I greeted him and walked inside, to find the tavern nearly empty. Only a few patrons here and there. "Hey Slick, how's it going?" Damien asked, as soon as I walked up to the bar. He leaned against the bar, with a toothpick in between his index finger and his thumb. I watched as he picked at something between his teeth. "Nothing much," I said, as I rolled up the sleeves of my shirt. "You know, Stacy needs some help in the kitchen. She's got another body to cut up and put away. I would help, but I need to man the bar," Damien said, and then slowly jutted his thumb over his shoulder. I looked back into the kitchen, and found Stacy struggling to chop through the bones of the body. I then looked at the tavern. Before I decided it was okay to leave Damien alone for a bit and walked to the kitchen. Stacy held the meat cleaver high above her head, and with all of her strength, brought the blade down. There was a loud metallic clang, as the cleaver managed to cut through the ligament, and the bone. She wiped her brow and sighed, as she went on to the shoulder. "Hey, do you need some help?" I asked. She looked up and smiled, before she gestured to the already mangled body. "Yeah, I need help getting through the bone," she said. After we packaged the body parts and put them away in the walk-in freezer, I walked back out to the bar. I found a mysterious man seated at the bar. He wore a long oversized coat, with a hat that covered the upper half of his face. He drummed his long nails against the top of the bar, and his yellow rat-like teeth clicked. "Can I help you?" I asked hesitantly. "Yes, I would like a Bloody Mary. Human blood please." The stranger squeaked out. He shivered underneath the thick winter coat, and his nose twitched, as he sniffed the air. I took a glance at him every once in a while, trying to figure out what type of monster he was. He was something I've never seen before. It's a rarity to meet new monsters around here. I passed him his drink and went to help another patron down the bar. The man hadn't touched his drink, but instead continued to look around the tavern. His nose twitched every once in a while, and his hand would reach for his pocket. Clearly the man was up to something. I let Damien know about the man's odd behavior, and told him to keep a close eye on him. I went to the back of the tavern for a quick smoke break. I haven't smoked in years, but, in this line of work, it kinda makes you want to. I took a long drag on the cigarette, and let the smoke sit in my lungs for a second, before I expelled it. My head felt fuzzy, from the sudden rush of nicotine. I leaned down to put the cigarette out, but was stopped by the strange man from the tavern. His body shook underneath the coat, and his teeth clicked together, as he sniffed the air. "Mind if I joined you?" the man squeaked out. He shuffled next to me with an arm out. Almost as if he was blind, I furrowed my brow, and used my own hand to guide him. "Thank you," he squeaked. "No problem," I replied. We stood in silence for a minute, as I tried to think up a way to ask him what kind of monster he was, without sounding rude or weird. "You're wondering what I am, aren't you?" he asked. I looked at him, and nodded my head. "It's not every day that I see someone like you," I said. The man chuckled, as he lit a cigarette and took a long drag. He shook under the coat again, and motioned towards the tavern. "Mind if we talked inside? It's getting colder by the day," he said. I nodded my head, and watched as he walked to the front of the tavern. I put out my cigarette and walked inside. He sat at the same stool as before, his Bloody Mary almost empty. I got started on another one for him, as he started to tell me how he broke a witch's heart. Phoebe was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, her hair, like honey, and her skin, like porcelain. The way the sun hit her face, and the way her eyes lit up as she smiled, he said sincerely. He then let out a painful sigh, and took another long drag of his cigarette before he continued. "Then one day, I woke up. Like this," he said. The man then removed his hat to reveal his mole rat face. I felt a pang of guilt, as he put his hat back on. He then reached into his pocket and pulled out a locket. He opened it up and stared at the picture inside. "She was beautiful, but I didn't deserve her," he said, shaking his head. He placed the locket on the counter. I leaned forward and peered at the picture. It was a honey blonde-haired woman. She had the widest smile, and her eyes did seem to light up. "I think it's about time I let go," the man said. He then asked me if I wanted to hang on to the locket for him. This made me feel gross. The guy wanted me to take the locket, because it was cursed. We get guys like him every once in a while. Cursed by witches. "Sorry, but employees are not allowed to take any items, or personal belongings from customers," I stated, as I headed back out for another smoke break. While Damien stayed behind the bar. There was a loud scream. I rushed back inside the tavern, to see Stacy behind the bar, her face twisted in horror. I rushed to the front and looked to the floor where Damien laid. I didn't know it was Damien, until he spoke. His pink wrinkled skin stretched as he said my name. The stranger was nowhere to be seen, his locket clutched in Damien's hand. I kneeled down, and stared at Damien's now mole rat face, and shook my head. "Why did you take the locket? You know you're not supposed to take anything from anyone," I said. I helped Damien up to his feet. He shook from the cold. Everyone else in the tavern looked on. As I went to the back to grab Damien his coat, he asked me if I wanted the locket. I didn't say anything, since I had another customer to tend to. Next thing I knew, he walked out of the tavern, leaving the locket behind, Damien said, as he pulled his coat on, and wrapped it around himself tight. Jimmy walked out from his office, and shook his head, as soon as he saw Damien. I grabbed the damn thing to give it back to him, but as soon as I grabbed it, I felt this hot searing pain in my face, Damien said, as he moved his head around, and panic finally set in. "I can't see," he shouted, as he grasped onto my arm and started to touch his face. He let out a painful sob, as he continued to feel his face. "I'll see what I can do, but for now, it seems you need to pass that locket on to someone else," Jimmy said, sadly. "You can't do that here. It'll be bad for business, if I let one of my employees curse a customer." The rest of the night, I worked the bar alone. Damien had quit, right then and there. Never touch an object that's been left behind.